What makes a good explorer? For some, it is fate, being in the right place at the right time. For others, it is hard, determined work. For Jane Goodall, it was a mix of both. But what all of these explorers have in common is an openness to new ideas, experiences, and possibilities. Jane Goodall, Exploring Empathy. Perhaps you could say that Jane Goodall wasn't the likeliest of explorers. She grew up in a middle-class family in England during the 1930s and 40s, with her mother, father, and sister. When she was old enough to begin to think about a career, her mother, Van Morris Goodall, suggested that she go to secretarial school, because secretaries could get jobs anywhere in the world, and Jane was interested in traveling. Jane agreed. One day, however, Jane received a letter from her best friend, Mary Claude Manchclow. Mary was a friend of Jane's from secretarial school. Jane was quite surprised to hear from her, since they had lost touch for a while. Mary said that her family had recently bought a farm in Tanzania. She invited Jane to come stay for a visit. Jane was in disbelief. She had always dreamed of going to Africa. As a child, she had been transported to this new and foreign land that was so different from the city and beaches in England by books like Tarzan, which she treasured and read frequently. She even thought she would be a better Jane for Tarzan than the actual character Jane, so of course, she replied with a resounding yes. However, before she could go on this exciting new adventure, she had to be able to pay for a round-trip ticket to Africa. So to save money, she quit her job, since it paid poorly, and moved back home where she worked as a waitress and saved up every penny she could. Finally, after months of hard, tedious work, she was able to take the first step on her new adventure. Explorations in Africa. Jane loved Africa. In order to be able to stay, she got a job as a secretary for Louis Leakey in Tanzania. Leakey and his wife, Mary, were famous paleoanthropologists and archaeologists. He eventually offered her a job to study the chimpanzees in Gombe National Park. He believed these chimpanzees would tell him more about how early man behaved. Leakey thought Jane's lack of education would help her to think differently from previous scientists. When Jane Goodall arrived in Gombe National Park, things weren't easy at first. She spent days exploring outside of camp, but she could only hear the chimpanzees calling in the distance. They were still frightened of her, as she was a strange, tall white animal they had never seen before. Every time she got close, they would run away. During this period, it was hard for Jane to stay optimistic, since she couldn't stay in Gombe if she didn't make any discoveries. Thankfully, that all changed when she met the chimp she named David Greybeard. He was the first chimpanzee to accept her and not run away. He was the bridge to the chimpanzees community.
And he helped to introduce me to this magic world out in the forest, because the other chimps would see David sitting there not running away, and so gradually they'd think, well, she can't be so scary after all. But he had a wonderful, gentle disposition. He was really loved by other chimps. The low-ranking ones would go to him for protection. He wasn't terribly high-ranking, but he had a very high-ranking friend, Goliath. And there was just something about him. He's got a very handsome face, his eyes wide apart, and this beautiful grey beard.
As Leakey had hoped, Jane Goodall's lack of formal education allowed her to bring a fresh approach to studying the chimpanzee's behavior. Unlike previous scientists, who focused on being objective, Jane Goodall focused on being empathetic. she tried to put herself in the chimpanzee's position to understand their behavior. By breaking away from the way scientists previously studied animals, Jane was able to make her groundbreaking discoveries.
Putting yourself in the animal's shoes helps you to understand behavior and ask questions that you might not ever ask. And it doesn't even have to necessarily be with a specific individual animal. You could say, think of something that might have to do with a whole group of animals, and therefore be able to be very objective, but still kind of have that mindset of, okay, if I'm looking at things this way, this is going to happen.
Despite criticism from the scientific community, Jane continued to use empathy in studying the chimps, and even named the chimps who she studied. Previously, the definition of man was an animal that used tools, but by thinking of how she would act in the chimpanzee situation, Jane was able to discover that the chimpanzees were using tools also. Previously, humans were the only animals thought to be capable of emotions, like happiness, sadness, and grief. But Jane Goodall discovered that this wasn't true either. Her discoveries had a profound effect on how we view animals. Because of her, we learned that animals do feel emotions. Significantly, we learned that animals experience suffering, which has helped raise awareness about animal abuse and deforestation. Jane continues to advocate for animals' rights to this day.
Not that long ago, it was still an acceptable practice to do a vivisection, which is basically a dissection on an animal while they were still alive, because we did not understand at that point that animals could feel pain and suffering and that sort of thing. So I think now training programs using, operant conditioning, using positive methods and positive reinforcement are now the normal in most facilities. They're not a novelty anymore, and I think that that's really important.
Jane Goodall redefined human and how to study animals, and brought a new generation of scientists with her.
And now scientists are actually able to measure some of those things, like stress and like maybe sadness and happiness in their blood levels and fecal levels. So I think we're getting closer and closer to understanding they are more like us than we ever gave them credit for.
Jane Goodall redefined how to study animals and brought a new generation of scientists with her. So what makes an explorer? Jane Goodall and other explorers have taught us that it means taking risks, whether it be fear of being ridiculed by others, as Jane Goodall was in the scientific community, or fear of physical danger. Africa was a new and breathtaking adventure for Goodall, but it was also scary to be in Gobi National Park because of the dangerous wild animals and land features. Without her courage and perseverance, Jane Goodall wouldn't have been able to discover what she did about the chimpanzees. Being a good explorer also means being open to new ideas and possibilities. Goodall showed that there's no cookie-cutter mold of an explorer. You don't have to come from a certain type of family or place, or follow in the paths of other explorers. Jane Goodall, after all, came from a middle-class family in London and only went to secretarial school. But by working hard, taking opportunities, and not being tied down to established ways of thinking, she was able to become the explorer Jane Goodall as we know today.